Welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Elizabeth Lotardo, a consultant, speaker, and author of the transformative book, Leading Yourself. Elizabeth's work has focused on helping individuals and organizations unpack purpose, build resilience, and achieve sustainable success. In this episode, Elizabeth will guide us through the principle that leading yourself is the cornerstone of happiness and success at work. She'll share her insights into why so many people struggle to find purpose in their roles and how shifting from passion to purpose can create more meaningful and consistent work. She will also tackle the challenges of negative assumptions, offer strategies to reframe change as opportunities for growth, and share lessons from stories of resilience, such as J.K. Rowling's journey and the pivots that led to Uber's success. So, whether you're looking to embrace a mindset of steady progress, build resilience in the face of change, or lead yourself to greater success, this conversation is filled with actionable advice and inspiring perspectives. Let's dive in. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we explore the stories, strategies, and insights of thought leaders who inspire us to think differently and lead better. Through candid conversations and expert perspectives, we dive into the challenges, breakthroughs, and practical lessons that shape exceptional leadership. Let's start with the mindset part, the managing the space between your ears, because that's the foundation of effective leadership. Developing that ability to manage your thoughts, find purpose, and adapt to change can transform how we experience both work and life. And my first question is really around this, because you emphasize the importance of finding purpose in your work. Why do so many people struggle with this?
I think, you've seen it. Purpose is at the front of the leadership conversation. And because of that, we often think it's this grand statement and we feel this amazing level of fulfillment when we find it. And if we don't have it, we're doomed. And people struggle to find purpose because a lot of jobs are really tactical. They're functional. They have long to do lists and overloaded inboxes and their bosses in their ear. And that experience feels really removed from the grander leadership conversation around this noble purpose mentality. So, when you can connect the two, when you can see the meaning behind your to do list, when you find fulfillment in these everyday tasks and interactions, and you deeply understand why they matter to someone beyond pleasing your boss, your performance and your personal happiness skyrocket.
I love how you challenge the common assumption that people spend their energy looking for purpose in their jobs instead of trying to create it, which I agree with you. That's a much better avenue to pursue because you differentiate between passion and purpose, noting that purpose is more constant. So perhaps unpack the difference between those two and speak to how someone can really discover or reignite that sense of purpose, even if their job feels mundane.
So often we equate purpose and passion, right? We lump them together into this feel good moment. But some research from Professor Morton Hansen out of UC Berkeley tells us differently. And he defines purpose as the belief that what you are doing matters, right? That it counts for something. In passion is the feeling of being personally excited about it. And what his research showed us is that purpose, the feeling that your work matters and that it's making a difference, has a much greater impact on our performance and our happiness than passion does. Because passion is individual. What's exciting to me is not necessarily exciting to you, while purpose is shared. Passion also waxes and wanes. A lot of jobs have elements that aren't particularly exciting. But when we point ourselves towards purpose, when we understand why those things matter, we feel more energy instead of trying to be like, oh, I'm excited, I'm excited, I'm excited, when you know in your gut you're not. So the good news is if parts of your job aren't thrilling, that's okay. You can still have a meaningful work experience when you tap into why it matters.
I love that distinction between the two. And you say to discover or reignite that purpose in a job that feels mundane, consider some of the following techniques. And one of them I really love, articulate your ripple effect. So perhaps you can unpack that also for our listeners.
So, when we're working remotely, when we're working in big organizations, when we're not directly interacting with customers, we're often removed from our ripple effect, right? Our work leaves our inbox and it goes to our manager or some other department, and we don't see it again. And we don't understand where it actually ended up. But when someone can trace their ripple effect, when they can take their functional to dos and ask, and then what happens? And then what happens? And then what happens? And get to why does this matter? Exploring that, I call it an impact map in leading yourself. That is what gives us the context our brain is craving. Because without it, without understanding our ripple effect, we're just bouncing around in cyberspace, right? Trying to check off deliverables in hopes for a good performance review. And that's hardly the setup for a fulfilling career experience. Understanding that, this matters. And even when it leaves my inbox, most of the time, it goes somewhere and it makes a difference. That's what gives us energy.
I love how you connect the dots, right? So people can see the impact that they're having. And like you said, many jobs, it's not explicit. So you really have to do, and then what happens to see that effect. Some other techniques that you provide, which also are great techniques and effective ones to explore, are explore your absence. Like in the movie, It's a Wonderful Life. What if you didn't exist, right? Or what if you weren't in that position in that company? Look at it at, those extended effects, right? What projects would stall, what tasks would go undone, even maybe at a family level too, just so you realize the impact and the effect you're having, which, like you said, is not always explicit.
It's not always explicit, and I think that, there was some interesting data from EY a few years ago about the purpose disconnect and how most organizations claim to have this sense of purpose, but as you move down through the organization, the connection to that sense of purpose fades. And at the front lines, it's less than 30%. Less than 30% of frontline employees believe that their organization's purpose matters at all and is connected to their role. That's a frighteningly low number for how much time and money we spend on crafting purpose. But again, you're right. The onus is on the individual. You have to forge that connection. It can't be done by your manager or HR.
And sometimes it's better just to get that from other people because they recognize your contributions more readily than you do. So ask your colleagues, your boss, your clients about the positive impact in your work. Be careful not to frame it in such a way that it appears arrogant or you're wanting or needing that, but that can really highlight value that you might be overlooking.
Absolutely. Others are more acutely aware of our impact than we are. What could be one simple email for you could make the entire work week easier for one of your colleagues. So there's a fine line. You certainly don't want to go fishing for compliments, especially to a senior leader, but following up and say, hey, did you have the information you needed to make a decision? How did that go? Those types of micro doses of, hey, here's how your work makes a difference, they're really important for our spirit.
Well, now understanding purpose is one thing, but breaking free from a lack of purpose cycle is another challenge entirely. So let's talk about some advice that you would give to someone who is stuck in that lack of purpose cycle and perhaps unpack that as well.
The cycle becomes self-fulfilling, right? When we think our work is meaningless and it doesn't matter, then we don't have a lot of creative ideas. We don't have a lot of energy. We don't build close relationships with the people around us. And because we're not doing those things, we feel really tired and we feel burnt out. There was some recent Glassdoor reporting that said two-thirds of people feel stuck at work. That's where that feeling comes from. And when you feel stuck at work, you don't see why it matters. So this maddening cycle can just go again and again and again and deepen our emotional disconnect from what we're doing on a daily basis. The good news is when you start a positive cycle, that is also self-fulfilling. When you tap into why your work matters and you believe that your work is making a difference, not that it's saving the world, not that you love it all the time, but that it matters, you have more energy, you come up with more ideas because you're more energetic and you're more creative, you're building better relationships with the people around you who are feeding back to you why the work is so important. So the question for an individual contributor is, what cycle are you jumpstarting? Are you going to disconnect from your work and start the cycle of a terrible work experience? Or are you going to tap into that sense of meaning, even if it's a little awkward and clunky at first, and build a really positive level of momentum for yourself?
Well, like you mentioned too, you can also shift that focus from seeking purpose to creating it, right? Instead of waiting for the job to be inherently purposeful, which I think too many people do, actively look for ways to make a difference in your current role and connect your work to that larger impact. Some of the onus really needs to be on the individual, especially on the front line, because you can't rely on organizations doing that for you.
Absolutely. The best organizations know this and are doing it. The most emotionally intelligent leaders are bridging the gap between what our team does on a daily basis and why it matters. But a lot of organizations aren't. And that doesn't mean they're bad places to work. You're going to work for a huge variety of leaders and a wide array of HR, varying levels of support over the course of your career. Your ability to do it for yourself is imperative.
And the other thing you mentioned too, which may not be apparent to many people is when we engage in our strengths at work, we're more likely to feel energized and motivated. So think about tasks that you enjoy and excel at and try to find ways to incorporate more of them into your daily work.
Absolutely. And think about the momentum, right? If you have a to do list with 10 things on it and you're really good at two of them, start with those two. You're going to feel more energy and that's going to carry you through the rest.
You say, compare your negative assumptions or load bearing neural pathways that are difficult to dismantle, examine them, and then identify ways in which you can overcome them or challenge those beliefs in order to replace them with more constructive ones.
Absolutely. It always comes back to childhood trauma, doesn't it? So, the example I use of a load bearing neural pathway, this belief that holds up lots of other beliefs and decisions and values through the course of our life, is the common load bearing neural pathway of work sucks. Maybe you heard your parents say that to you. Maybe you see it a lot on TikTok. Whatever is going on has solidified this belief that, work just isn't good. And because you hold that core belief, often at a young age, this is formed in us early in our careers when we have a bad boss, for example, you don't push for it to be better. You accept a mediocre boss. You don't seek other career opportunities. You think the feeling of emptiness and longing for Friday is normal. And you move through your career that way. And all the decisions, all the relationships, all the prioritization you do is rooted in that belief of, well, work sucks. It is what it is, right? But when we examine that load bearing belief, that load bearing neural pathway that holds up so much of the way we are at work, and we start to dismantle it, we pave the way for actual change. So easier to describe than done, right? So, what do you do when you're taking down a load bearing wall? You add support beams. So, if we are going to dismantle this load bearing belief that, work sucks, it's hard, and nobody likes it, we need to add support beams. We're going to look for examples of when work actually felt good. We're going to talk to people who don't believe that, who believe work is meaningful and work can be a force for good in the world and in your life. We are going to actively point ourselves to the parts of our job that we enjoy. Not all of it, just those parts. And over time, through these small support beams, we are going to remove that core belief that's in us. Again, often from so early on, that work is really hard and that it sucks. And you can take that same mental approach with some other common load bearing neural pathways like, oh, nice guys finish last, or nobody wants to work, or all these millennials and Gen Z, they're so lazy, right? When you bring your awareness to that core belief and you understand how it's upholding so many of your decisions, and you make a proactive effort to dismantle it, you add in some support so not so much is resting on that, you start to really change your mindset at work.
Love that analogy of load bearing beliefs and adding these support beams because instead of trying to simply eliminate negative thoughts, you have to actively replace them with constructive beliefs. And by creating a list of your common negative assumptions and generating these alternative positive statements, it's definitely more effective to counteract them. One that you list in the book, I've never had the resources. Well, replace it with, I am resourceful and I can find creative solutions. But it's hard to do and it's hard to catch yourself in the moment so you don't go too far down that pathway, right? Before you say, wait a minute, I need to reframe this.
Absolutely. And this is an ever present challenge for all of us humans, right? Bringing self awareness to a point of tactical maneuvering and knowing how what we think is impacting our behavior, making a proactive effort to change that. And I'm not perfect at this. I wrote this book and I said in the introduction because I'm really in the early parts of my career was not good at self leadership, right? I bended to the direction of those around me. I focused on all the things that were wrong and that I couldn't control. And I felt really empty at work for a while. And over time, through my own self study, through seeing it in others, through adding my own support beams, I got better, but I'm still a work in progress.
And that's important to remember that changing ingrained thought patterns takes time and effort. Be patient with yourself, practice consistently, and celebrate those small victories along the way. I love one of the ones that you give, the example of the Stockdale paradox, which was named after Admiral James Stockdale, who survived over 7 years as a prisoner of war in Vietnam, emphasizing the importance of balancing unwavering faith in the eventual success with a clear eyed assessment of the current challenges. And he highlights the importance really of this, of balancing faith and success with confronting brutal realities, because that's who survived the concentration camps and made it out okay. How can this principle be applied to kind of day to day leadership and personal growth?
The Stockdale paradox lands with so many, and it was originally written about by Jim Collins in Good to Great. And the sentiment of it is you must confront the brutal facts that are in front of you, right? Hiding under the blanket does nobody any good. Having said that, you also must hold on to unwavering faith that you will prevail. So let's take that sentiment from Prisoner of War Camp, where James Stockdale first came up with it, and apply it to current workplace challenges. We are all afraid of AI. It may have some negative implications on our work, especially as leaders. We are all dealing with uncertain economies. We're not sure how this thing is going to go. We are all up against rapid change and huge pressure to deliver. Those are the brutal facts of our reality. And we're looking them in the face, right? It's not all sunshine and roses these days. Having said that, when as individuals we hold on to the faith that we will prevail, that's when hope emerges. So I think the temptation for a leader is to lean into toxic positivity and say, "Hey, it's going to be great. The economy is going to rebound." All of these things. But when we do acknowledge them and make a vow to operate anyway and believe that we will make it through, we start to get the best thinking from ourselves and from our teams.
Courage is another reoccurring theme in the book. And you mentioned a great movie. I love this movie as well. We Bought a Zoo with Matt Damon, and it's he has a scene in there to say all you really need is 20 seconds of insane courage. How can this concept be applied in the corporate world where the risks often feel higher and the stakes are more visible?
So the risk often feel higher. Double click on the word feel. That doesn't mean they necessarily are higher. As people, we tend to overestimate the level of risk inside of our organization. We think if we raise our hand with an idea that's not great, everyone is going to think we're an idiot forever. And very rarely is that the case. The challenge is our primal brain is naturally wired to identify the risk. It doesn't really work if we point it to the reward first. Your brain is always assessing, am I going to look bad? Is there a potential for shame here? Am I going to risk my job? What's my boss going to think? You don't have to do any kind of prompting to gauge the risk of raising your hand at work. Where courage comes in is you do have to prompt your brain to accurately articulate the potential upside. It's not going to do it on its own. Again, our brain is designed to keep us safe, not to make us, happy and courageous at work. But when you articulate the potential upside, like raising your hand with a new idea, maybe there's a small risk that it won't land. What's the upside? Your boss views you as a creative, strategic thinker. The idea gets executed and you have this massive win for your career. Your peers have a little bit more respect for you, right? These elements of positivity are often ignored because the voice of you're gonna look not good is so loud. But when you can point your brain to the optimistic alternative, you can make a more rational decision. It doesn't mean you have to do it, just take time to explore it.
And that articulating that upside, gather evidence, challenge those negative assumptions, and really embrace that 20 seconds of insane courage because courage is taking action despite the fear that you're facing. And that initial fear I found might be intense, but it's going to subside if you start taking action.
A helpful question for me is what's the worst case scenario, right? It's often not as bad as the pit in your stomach would make you to believe. No one's going to put some billboard with your face on it that says always has terrible ideas, right? The worst case scenario in most corporate endeavors, like pitching an idea, raising your hand for something, trying a new product, they're pretty minor on the scale of human suffering, right? We can bounce back from most of those. So when you accurately articulate what's the real risk, not just I'm too afraid to do this, and when you accurately articulate what's the potential upside, you can make more rational decisions with confidence.
And there's a lot of risk and uncertainty and fear around change as well. And change is really inevitable, like you were mentioning. And how we approach it really makes all the difference. And I love how you kind of rephrase it. So, what if we view change as an opportunity for growth? How can we help individuals reframe that change concept into that new perspective, especially when they feel exhausted or overwhelmed by the amount of change they're constantly being bombarded with every day?
So in my book, I cite some work from Cassandra Worthy, who is a change management expert and has trademarked change enthusiasm. And the first time I heard that phrase, change enthusiasm, I was like, who in their right mind is enthusiastic about the volume of change happening now? But what she unpacks in her work is that when you can get yourself to a point of this change is happening, I have to find something in this. I have to find the small piece of growth opportunity for me. I have to find the potential upside for my organization. I have to, in some way, get on board with this. You gain so much personally. Nobody likes that person crossing their arms saying, not going to work, right? If you know this is going forward anyway, it is on you to find some element of positivity, even if it's going to be a deep learning experience for you that may not play out how you want. The way we point our brains there is predictive of how much energy and success we have on the other side of a change.
Failure also is something that leaders don't like to consider or think about, but failure and reinvention are reoccurring themes in any great leader. And you have two great lessons about J.K. Rowling and the Uber founder, and they gave up on earlier efforts before finding success, even though the public persona is they just persevered and their initial projects were overwhelming successes. They just had to be resilient in those times in which they were getting failure after failure.
Right. LinkedIn is full of hype posts, right? JK Rowling was rejected by 20 something publishers. The founders of Uber were turned down when they initially asked for VC investment. And LinkedIn really holds those up. But what's beneath it is both of those people and every other successful leader out there had failures prior to that. They had things they gave up on. So when we tout this narrative of it's all about persistence and you never give up, we delude people to wasting a lot of time on ideas they should cut ties with. And part of self leadership is being able to accept when something isn't working, being a project you're working on, a product you're launching, your job, your organization. When you can say, okay, pure grit is not going to change the outcome on this one. You give yourself permission to pivot. And that is what so many of us are looking for in this moment.
Such a great message to hear that failure is not the end. Initial setbacks do not define your long term success, as evidence in those two stories. And recognize when to pivot, when to give up and abandon a path that's not working. The sunk cost is real. And many people just go down that path too far before saying, I just need to stop and give up. But giving up doesn't mean I'm giving up on my dream. I'm just going to find another pathway toward it.
Absolutely. You're not closing the door to your entire future. You're simply changing direction.
Also, another thing that I find is uncertainty often paralyzes people, but top performers seem to thrive despite it. What habits can you help others to adopt to have a better mindset in this VUCA environment where things are constantly changing and you really can't wait for certainty before you take action?
Well, I think you hit it with you can't wait for certainty to take action. So often we fall into the trap of when everything's all settled, right? When my reorg is complete, when the product is perfect, when my resume is completely buttoned up, in that moment is when I'm finally going to do it. But that moment isn't coming. There's always going to be an element of uncertainty. And one area may get a little more clear, but guess what? That means somewhere else is getting a little bit more hazy. In our ability to quiet our amygdala, to see the opportunity inside of uncertainty, and to move forward anyway, back to articulating the upside and saying, what can we do in the face of this? That is predictive. So when we think about this current day and age, uncertainty is the word of the decade, right? It is no one knows how some of these huge changes like AI, like the economy, how these things are going to play out. But our ability to operate anyway tells us how we are going to fare no matter what happens. And holding your breath and waiting for it all to be settled, you'll be holding your breath a real long time.
So we've established the right mindset, and these really have spoken and focused on the mindset. The next step, and I think this is where the rubber meets the road, is translating these consistent behaviors that align with our personal and professional goals. Behavior translates mindset into action by building habits, managing energy, and setting realistic goals. So let's focus on some of these. And when it comes to achieving goals, which you mentioned, which I completely agree with, consistency outshines intensity. We always at the new year, right? We have a lot of intensity to do something different to uphold our New Year's resolutions, but we're not consistent enough to achieve those goals.
I saw some stat that was like 75% of people abandon their New Year's resolution by January 15th, with only 2 weeks into the new year. And the reason that is we're way overly ambitious with what we can accomplish. We overestimate the ability to change our long-standing habits. More often, we are able to make small incremental changes that over time give us the results we want. But making a 180, don't delude yourself, it hardly ever works. So when we translate that to goal setting from a professional sense, I want to walk a fine line here because sometimes your goal is handed to you, right? You don't get to decide what you're going to achieve this year. Someone else has decided for you and passed that fun fact along. But there are also moments where you decide for yourself what's important to you this year. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. So when you're looking at what does it mean for me to be successful this year, whether you have a goal that's handed to you by your manager or not, I'd encourage you to pick something realistic that is within your control, not some grand promise of complete transformation, not something that depends a lot on other people, like I'm going to, get promoted. That can't be a goal because you don't own it alone. It takes other people to weigh in. Picking something attainable that you can control is the key to sustained progress. When we have overly ambitious targets, when we have goals that depend on other people, when we have these lofty expectations, that's when we fall off really early.
Someone once told me that we drastically overestimate what we can do in a week or a month, but we underestimate what can happen in a year or a longer time frame. And people don't like playing the long game. I had Dory Clark on the podcast a while back, and she is, it's all about consistent efforts, getting 1% better each and every day. And over the long term, that translates into big results. But embrace the magic of the pursuit. True fulfillment, which I don't think many people realize, comes from the process of pursuing your goals, not just from reaching the end result, because at the end, there's always another goal to achieve. Like what another guest of mine said, Ruth Gautier, said, it's just, there's always something bigger out there on the horizon and it's never ending.
I cite Dr. Gautier in my book Leading Yourself and her work on Olympic athletes and what fuels them for that sustained level of progress. And the same plays out in a professional setting. The magic is always in the pursuit. If you've ever gotten a promotion, launched a product, closed a big deal, you often wake up the next day feeling the same. And that's a really scary feeling when you have your entire bank of fulfillment riding on this moment. But when you can appreciate the journey instead of holding your breath for the destination, you feel a lot better in the process, right? We shouldn't all be living our lives for December 31st when we finally hit our goals for the year, right? That's no way to live because on January 1st, you get a new goal.
Absolutely. And you have common pitfalls that you mentioned, which I see a lot in leaders and really in everyone. They're the plate spinning phenomenon, the hockey stick projections, and really the one I love to focus on first is the output based promises. So don't have your goals based on the output that's dependent on other people. Base them more on the input that you can provide into those goals and the effort that you can show.
Absolutely. These traps play out organizationally. They also play out on an individual level. So let's zoom in on that output one first. We often think, and I'll use sales as an example, that we can have a goal, a result that is dependent on a billion factors, right? So let's use a sales revenue target. I'm going to sell for my company $10 million this year. I'm going to make President's Club. What factors go into that? Yes, you doing all of your follow-ups and things like that, but you also probably depend on a good economy. You depend on not being upset by a competitor, some player that hasn't emerged yet. You depend on your customers paying their invoices on time. You depend on your product performing as promised. There are so many elements that go into that goal that you cannot control. So what happens when that is the case? We either meet the goal and we thank our lucky stars that everything aligned and hope that it happens again and we feel out of control and just lucky, or we don't meet the goal and we feel terrible because all of these things that we didn't control contributed to us not meeting this number that we connected our success with. How do you prevent that from happening to you? You extrapolate out what is in your control. So let's go back to our revenue target. You're going to sell $10 million to your company this year. What is in your control? A goal to, I'm going to complete 15 outbound calls a day. I'm going to respond to my customers within 24 hours. I'm going to make sure I spend an hour every Monday morning researching my industry and what's happening, so I'm informed in these conversations. All of these elements that you can more deeply own, that's where effective goal setting happens, because you're not dependent on some outside force playing into whether you do or do not achieve this. You know you can do it. And knowing that you alone are responsible gives you zero out and zero blame when it doesn't play out.
Well, and the other two as well, having that plate spinning phenomenon, just juggling too many balls in the air at once, right? You need to focus on less if you want to have a greater impact with those. And then the hockey stick phenomenon is just realizing that when you start any endeavor, you're not going to have this incremental or exponential growth. It's going to be stagnant or possibly going to get worse before it gets better. So if you have that mindset in mind, then it makes it easier to endure and be there for the long term.
The hockey stick projection is one of my favorite graphics in the book, and it comes to us from Silicon Valley, which is when early stage startups are meeting with investors. They have this slow, slow, slow line of growth, but they're predicting right after a big investment, everything is going to skyrocket. So their anticipated revenue graph looks like a hockey stick. It's starting off really slow, and then all of a sudden, it's crazy successful. And we do that same thing to ourselves, right? I know that I've gotten promoted from junior to senior to director, but I'm going to be the CEO in 2 years. And you really cost yourself a lot, because when you land in the middle of the hockey stick, you perform really well, but you feel like you failed.
And when goals don't turn out the way you want, you need to take ownership, right? You need to take responsibility for failure, and don't over apologize, because that undermines your confidence. I hope this episode has provided you with valuable insights. If it has, I ask you to share it with someone who would also benefit from it. If you've been enjoying and gaining knowledge from this podcast, then subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you can find all the previous episodes of the podcast and additional learning resources. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify and leave up to a 5-star review.